Hello.
Hello, that's right. I'm Pete.
Well, I'll start by saying we're back again.
Yes,
And
we've slightly jiggered the entire starting bit around, haven't we? So yes, I yeah.
yeah, and uh, due to like a request, I think we have to introduce ourselves, which is I think is a bit weird, but we'll do it anyway. So, in case you didn't know, I'm Shabazz Mohammed.
I'm Pete Marshall. Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and
Feels slightly odd saying it. It feels slightly odd being like this is yeah. But still, I
and
suppose we're already like transmitting ourselves around the world. So yeah.
yeah. So, what have we got on today's show then?
Well, we decided to talk about the on um, Harper letter on justice and open debate.
Okay.
And honestly, this kind of got into the UK around J.K. Rowling and all of that. So in some ways, it will be a discuss. So in some ways, I'll be ignoring that particular context because I think Harper's isn't especially British, and I think it wasn't specifically done for J.K. Rowling kind of situation. I would also say that neither of us are trans, and so if you want to hear about like what trans people thought about the entire situation, then there are many better people to talk to than us. So that isn't really something we could speak about on value.
Yeah.
The first bit will be specifically about the letter, and honestly, we mostly discussion of freedom of speech, honestly,
Yeah.
because and the second bit will be kind of um, because I think the letter was horrendously mishandled. Um, I'll probably try talking about kind of talking about kind of the larger context of freedom of speech because as much as I can, as much as yeah, because I think I will critique um, the letter and say why I think it's wrong, but I don't think it would be just if I was just to be like, yeah, they're completely bad, and so I will put and now I'm gone. I'm not going to say
Yeah.
anything more. So yeah,
So, what best way do you think to start this? Should we
well,
start by s- say
I mean,
talking about some of the letter?
I mean, the letter basically was a broad and very kind of liberal. Um, I'm not sure whether it be liberal or neoliberal. I don't think there's a distinction really in this context. But basically, it's a very liberal letter saying that there is a restriction of freedom of speech, and that we should, and that this is a bad thing, and that this is helping Donald Trump, and that it's it's honestly it's slightly it's I'm going to go into this later on, but I think that but it does have this kind of vague implication that on the one hand the problem is the left because the problem's always the left at this point, and on the other hand it's talking about how it is emboldening the right without actually talking about their kind of responsibility for it, which yes, that's and yeah, it uses words like conformity and liberal society and various, and yeah.
But do you think it's worth going through some of the letter for people that haven't got through it or
I
not?
mean, it's on the internet. It's not behind a paywall or anything. And
Okay.
honestly, it's fairly like basically close your eyes, think of a letter giving a brave defense of sorry, I was doing rabbit ears, but brave defense of freedom of speech
Yeah.
from a vaguely liberal perspective, and then basically you've got it. It's not particularly creative. It's not particularly imaginative. You know, um, it's fairly American, but yeah. So honestly, I mean, all I'm going to say about it, apart from that, is like 150 different people put their names to it, and so to some degree, I don't. There are a lot of different people, and so to give you an idea, it has everyone from Noam Chomsky right way through to some like pretty like right wing Republicans, that by British standards would be like borderline Jacob Rees-Mogg kind of political spectrum. So honestly, it has a massive political spectrum behind it. And to some degree, I'm not going to talk about, I don't want to do like a hatchet job on them, because to some degree, some of them I think would actually agree with me largely. Some of them would, some of them, probably most of them would not understand where I'm coming from on many of this. Hopefully they'd have a better understanding if they listen to the podcast. And some of them would know exactly where I was coming from and be like, yes, but I benefit from the system that you're talking about. So and just be cynical assholes essentially. And so there's different groups, and I'm not going really going to talk about individuals in this particular discussion because I don't think that helps. Yeah.
And to start with, then, just for debate's sake, could you tell me where you're coming?
I mean, the thesis statement.
Where you're coming from on this?
The thesis statement is going to be, I think the problem with the letter was that it, to put it in the pretentious terms, it was a mishandling of the semantic resources. And I think the two most interesting words that I think it mishandled was the words conformism and liberal society. And basically this means that I think that a lot of the argument based themselves around those two ideas and those two words. And I don't think they understood what both, I think that they had a very specific or narrow understanding of those two words. And I think that ended up distorting the entire thing. And yes, so I will be talking about, yeah. So yeah, I will start off.
What is the title of the letter? Just,
I mean, basically, it's just a letter on justice and open debate. So again, What I said before, it is no creativity, no imagination, no uniqueness. Honestly, yeah.
What do you think the purpose of it is?
The
real purpose.
I mean, again, I think that there were many different purposes. This is part of the reason why I said at the start that I'm not going to talk about individuals, because I think that, like, Noam Chomsky, for example, has very different perspectives than some of the more far-right people who signed. And honestly, I think some of them were trying to distort discussions. Noam Chomsky was probably in his heart of hearts, didn't think this would have any effect whatsoever, but always signs anything that has freedom of speech on the And honestly, loads of them are like some of the people more in the center will probably just thought, well, it has freedom of speech and it's signed by Noam Chomsky and blah blah blah, so my name will sound very good coming next to their names. So but basically, okay, I think so on liberal society, one of the major points I think that liberal society was kind of mishandled was there is an assumption that the letter makes, and I think, to be fair, many people would make, that liberal society is something like America in the 1960s. Now, the problem with this is if the assumption around liberal is free, and again, the words are very often kind of used interchangeably, then I would argue that America in the 1960s was barely free. Like, honestly, there were many different groups who were not free. And so if the assumption is that a liberal society is America in the 1960s, and if the assumption is that that therefore, if we went back to America in the 1960s, we would therefore have a free debate, and therefore everything would be fine. I mean, the most obvious point from this is, honestly, the hippies, part of the reason why they went into their religious-y things, and they went into like cults, and they went into communes and things, was because they got basically politically burnt and just got got shoved out of the political debate. I mean, honestly, I live with someone who was in the movement at that point, and he was so disillusioned by the fact. And in the end, on another day, I have a deeper analysis about how I don't think that they genuinely understood what they were getting into. But nevertheless, I don't, the political system was not listening to everybody. And honestly, if you look at like the last time we had more race riots and protests and things, it was in the 1960s. That is the time everyone's going back to, again, especially in the US. That's the context of the letter, so I'll deal with that as the context of this. So in the end, and again, you know, Martin Luther King said at that time that like riot is the language of the oppressed. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that they weren't being listened to by the political system, and what the letters and so we're supposed to go back to that, and then we will become more free. And this is kind of where I where I start going, okay, who becomes more free? Because in the end, at this point, we've already got two massive groups who definitely are not becoming more free. And honestly, you could, and honestly, there was a larger. So yeah, there's two groups, and so what? I mean, there's a larger discussion around freedom of speech that I don't think that we have a. I think we have a muscle memory. We think we understand what freedom of speech looks like. I don't think we do, and I don't think that genuinely and this ends up meaning that this kind of letter ends up saying a lot less than it actually wants to. This is and you know, this is part of why and I think that this goes back to a thing that I think that again, this leads to a separate kind of part of this debate, where there is a general feeling, and again, actually, to be fair, if you listen to people like Timothy Snyder, who's an academic on fascism, actually, if you listen to many academics on fascism, then they don't believe this. But I think many people, and the writers of this letter, and most of the signatories probably do believe this, that freedom of speech kills fascism or stops fascism in some way. Here's the thing about that: it didn't work it didn't work last time. You know, if you look at the Second World War, real talk, Britain basically spent. If you look at how America got into the Second World War, then basically we had a dude called William Stevenson, who essentially his job was to plant fake news. He basically overtly he turned one particular protest into a riot in order to manipulate things. He manipulated the CIA shamelessly in order to get America into the Second World War, which ended up with the Allies beating the Nazis. We could get, you know, if you look at Britain during that time, Britain didn't become more liberal because it was fighting fascism. You know, at that point, there was a great deal of, the left was actually fairly brutally put down. You know, there was some absolutely huge, like, political movement around that time, and basically Winston Churchill and the centre basically manipulated the shit out of the situation, and basically in order to push the left away. And so, again, I don't. If the assumption here is that freedom of that you know, there's a very 60s notion of like having like bumper stickers on your guitar saying "This machine kills fascism." Well, no, actually, I mean. And honestly, this leads into a deeper discussion about the fact that fascism basically will use any system and will moneyball, aka it will basically market within any system it can and manipulate it. And so the only way of fighting fascism is fighting fascism. It is explicitly making systems that exclude fascists. And in the end, if you ain't got that, they will manipulate any other system you can imagine. So in the end, if you're not prepared to actually create those systems, then you ain't getting that effect. So honestly, this letter, I think, goes back to a time. It believes in a notion of a liberal society, that it believes in the notion of a liberal society that is also a free society. And I would argue that, again, I know the two words mean almost exactly the same thing, but I would argue that if America during the 1960s was a liberal society, then it wasn't, that isn't an ideal to be strove for. It certainly wasn't free for everyone, and it certainly wasn't a model of free debate. I mean, one of the more interesting things to me, and this kind of leads back to why I think that these words, again, why I talk about mishandling the semantic resources. Philosophers is actually a very restricted group. Like philosophers are not very diverse. And one of the most fascinating discussions that I've heard on this was actually, if you go back to again, late 60s, when Martin Luther King and Malcolm X were kind of at their height, and there was large amounts of if you look at what the philosophy departments were doing at that time to do with justice, they actually had some amazing political justice people. None of them were talking about racial justice. So in the end, apparently I would say that one of the big problems with the reason why again, conformism is mishandled, because I think that conformism is a lot closer to what they were doing than they were trying to show conformism as what SJWs, these left-wing people, were doing. And honestly, I would say conformism is what the letter was doing. And so if they wanted to argue against conformism, they would have actually they would have done that. They did not. And honestly, yeah.
Go on. Were you going to say something?
So yeah, I would say conformism, if they're, and part of the reason why it's so difficult to talk about this is because honestly, groups like philosophers and blah blah, groups like philosophers, language professors, many different groups actually, are they're not actually the same people who actually have to set the rules of the road around freedom of speech. And honestly, if they were, then we would have a lot more incisive debates, and we would have a lot more interesting debates. I mean, to be honest with you, there has been a philosophical discussion for the last eternity, basically since freedom of speech became a significant value, of how do you tolerate people who are intolerant of freedom of speech within freedom of speech. Because in the end, that is, there's this notion that it's kind of the ultimate bug in the system, that if freedom of speech helps people who are anti-freedom of speech, then you will never get freedom of speech. But I think that there is a more subtle thing, that actually the people who write the rules of the road are, they never care about those debates. Real talk, if you're talking about kind of, probably in the West, the most significant constriction of freedom of speech was after the kind of during the Great Society. At the end of the Great Society, there was a group called the Wobblies, who in the modern day would be the equivalent of Momentum, although they were a lot more effective and actually were part of the reason why the Great Society and all the massive amounts of funding was released. And actually they were very significant for the kind of the rise of America. But basically what happened to them, and again, this is history, so there is books written about this, there is papers, there is blah blah blah, but basically basically McCarthyism, which is what's more normally known, was the tip of a massive iceberg of basically you couldn't be a university professor, you couldn't even be a secondary school teacher if you had been a member of the Wobblies. Imagine that no one who was part of Momentum or any communist group or anything more left wing than kind of the center of the Labour Party was disallowed from doing anything more than being a primary school teacher. And certainly that meant that they couldn't take part in debates. There was actually some very significant professors who were basically disbarred and thrown out and completely anything that they fired, and anything they wanted to say was no longer taken seriously. So again, this is, and honestly, I think if you want to argue, I think that there's a deeper argument that I'll go into in kind of the next half hour of part of moving forward means not believing in stupid things. And real talk, like in the end, I think that part of the problem with freedom of speech is that it kind of allows people who shouldn't be talking about something to continue talking about something, and everyone else has to sit back and like actually listen to them. And in the end, part of a forward moving society is not fighting the same debate 50 different times because one person in your town goes, well, I still think that there should be slavery, and then everyone else in the town is like, oh dear God, you mean we have to talk about slavery again? And in the end, and so I think part of the problem with this is, I think we need to be a lot more subtle and nuanced about what we argue over, why we're arguing over it, who is allowed into the room, what is it that we expect to get from this, how is it that we think society is going to move forward. And without all of those kinds of questions, I think just having some bland freedom of speech thing, you just end up walking around in circles. Of course, there's always going to be conspiracy theorists who think, well, I'm more comfortable taking hydrochloroquine as apart from like wearing a mask, so I'm not going to wear a mask. Well, you know what? That means other people are going to die. In the end, society has a choice. We can either give those people an option to be idiots and to put the rest of us at risk, or we cannot. And at some level, it will suck for them, but at some level, like the question, So I think that in some level, I think endlessly like being religiously pro freedom of speech is actually not, I'm not sure that that's a particularly progressive attitude in some ways. But I also think that in the end, there is a distinct discussion that freedom of speech is naturally, we need to have lots of different views. Many people need to be consider themselves to be part of discussions. Part of the entire thing about Black Lives Matter is because they haven't been part of these discussions. So at the same time as me saying that maybe some people should be excluded, well, some people are excluded and have been excluded for decades. It's also a thing about, I think part of Jeremy Corbyn and all that was that though the people that like Jeremy Corbyn, many of their ideas have been excluded, again, for decades. And so part of what they liked about him was exactly that. There is a significant discussion about, well, maybe they shouldn't be excluded. Maybe the fact that there was that much energy, maybe that should be brought in as part of the actual political system. And so part of a liberal society, I think, if liberal society is to mean anything apart from just like Peter, technically it means the Rock. But honestly, like, we just use it as like a word, just like a noise word that we refer to each other as. And if we want to start using liberal society, it's just like, well, what we did in the 1960s. I think if we want to use that in, more as it's more by its kind of very definition, then to some degree we do need to think about who we're excluding, and we do need to re-justify why we're excluding them and what we think is actually going to come of that.
Can I say something now?
Of course.
I didn't want to curtail your freedom of speech. So
maybe my freedom of speech should be curtailed.
Yeah, well, we'll let other people judge that. I wanted to say, do you think this letter has achieved anything?
It has confused a great deal of the situation and ended up making J.K. Rowling feel more confident in her position.
And
that's
I was also going to say that this letter seems to be, for me, kind of, I haven't looked at all the names on the list, but it seems to be kind of like old, like middle-aged people generally, and like, you know, what I'm trying to get at here is they kind of, they're not people that have made their name in the media, the social media world, or social media age, if you want
Yeah.
to call it. So it's a kind of way of kind of, they feel kind of threatened, and they're feeling, they're kind of trying to preserve their own
I mean,
brands in a way.
I'll go into that in more detail later on, because honestly, I think that there is a very specific reason why it's generally why it's middle class people, and generally that at this point that tends to be kind of 40, 50, 60 somethings. But I think that there's, but yeah, I think that there is, and again, actually, one of the other points I'm going to raise later on about, I think that they have a much more less nuanced debate about if you're basically if you're online, there's a lot more nuance around platforming and deplatforming people, and there's a lot more nuance around audiences as well. So honestly, it's one thing to say that this person should have freedom of speech. Okay, but does that mean that does that mean that someone who has 10,000 followers on Twitter should, retweet them and like make and give them a bigger audience? Does that mean that you have to? If you're talking about like in the media world, like if you have someone who's on TV, if you have someone on TV, again, you're giving them a massive audience. They have freedom of speech without that audience. So yeah. The same with J.K. Rowling. I mean, honestly, part of the reason people were annoyed with her, or part of the people's response to her, wasn't the fact that they were constricting her freedom of speech. It was the fact that they were preserving their kind of economic interests. The same with Wiley, actually, that happened this week. In the end, he turned out to be anti-Semitic, and in the end, why did Twitter delete his feed, and why was he deleted? Was push out his management and stuff. In the end, to some degree, freedom of speech, all that a negative freedom of speech means is that the government doesn't stop you. It doesn't mean that companies have to actually endorse your views. It doesn't mean that like people have to continue buying your CDs. It doesn't mean that your career has to like go on unabridged. Like in the end, other people have a right to have opinions too. And if your opinions disagree with their opinions, in the end, especially if you're kind of a management company and a music company, part of your brand is the people who you manage.
Yeah.
And so if the brand you want to have actually ends up being diminished by Wiley, for example, is it your duty to damage your own brand in order to allow him to continue making money from saying or from despite him saying this kind of shit? Like in the end, that's not the same discussion.
Yeah.
And yeah.
But should we move on to the next?
Yeah, to be honest with you, loads of my thoughts from that question was very interesting, but it is going to be answered in the next thing. So I was kind of
so should we move on to the next one? So this is again freedom of speech and cancel culture, right?
And second, sorry, faffing around. There. Okay, right. Well, I mean, it's more, I think, a more nuanced discussion around freedom of speech, because I think in some ways what I've done is basically say why I think that their notion of freedom of speech is wrong.
But now in this section, I want to push back a bit on some of the stuff that you're saying and have more of a kind of discussion around it,
Yeah.
and bring you to the question of freedom of speech and disabled people.
Yeah, I mean, honestly,
how
one of the things.
how we can actually encourage and enhance that. Really.
I mean, one of the things I will say is that part of freedom of speech is, and again, I talked mostly about two specific groups or three specific groups who didn't have freedom of speech. But honestly, I think one of the things that happened in the 60s as well is disabled people got a lot more freedom of speech than they'd ever had in the past. Again, in the US, in the UK, it was, you know, it was mostly late 60s and with the social model and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
So honestly, I would say, yeah. So honestly, I'd say before that, there was a distinct lack of freedom of speech in one of the groups was specifically disabled people.
And can I just say at this point, I know we talk about America and the UK a lot, but there are other countries out there, you know.
Oh yeah.
I'm just saying, for people listening around the world, we don't. I at least don't forget about you, and I'm not sure Pete does either.
I don't. It's mostly because I know a lot more context in the US, and I know bits and pieces from other places.
Yeah.
But honestly, I would be a lot less confident in like whether I understood the nuances around it. I mean, one thing I would say, one interesting point I would say, that is, I think freedom of speech. Anyway, I think freedom of speech is. I think actually there's an interesting discussion around the word liberal, because I think that in many ways liberal, and again, we still, you know, if you are liberal with your funds, that means you're being generous.
Yeah.
And actually, I think, so actually, if you go back to what a liberal society would actually be, if we were to use the definition, it's actually not just a society that allows people to do whatever they want or say whatever they want. It's also a society that actually funds people and having freedom of speech. And honestly, what that looks like is the arts funding that we give. I mean, we very often forget that honestly, going to things, being the audience, actually that's giving people more freedom of speech. And that means that thinking about, and that means that especially, and honestly, this is an especially important topic when it comes to kind of young people, because honestly, if you're J.K. Rowling, to some extent, you already have a megaphone. Like, even if you're only using your Twitter feed and your website and blah, 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 you've already got a megaphone to say whatever you want, and loads of people will hear you. Honestly, if you're a university student and you're making your first film, there's a distinct discussion about how society should actually emphasize your speech. That's not a bad argument, you know. And honestly, in terms of how artists start their careers, make their careers, there's also and so honestly, in terms of how that funding works, in this category, there's also academics, because in the end, not all people's like freedom of speech is just is in art. Actually, quite a lot of it, especially the social model, quite a lot of freedom of speech is paid for by universities. And in the end, when we start underfunding universities and lack of funding for universities, then that ends up, then you've got less speech, and you've got less platforms. So in the end, deplatforming. So in the end, Manchester University no longer having a Department of Disability Studies deplatforms a lot of people. And in the end, it's all very well arguing that like J.K. Rowling shouldn't have been shamed in her trans thing. That's arguing one particular point on freedom of speech. But in the end, why didn't these people stand up for the disability studies department in Manchester University?
Why didn't we?
I mean, honestly, what it would have required is like probably 50 odd grand. I mean, I have a more nuanced discussion around disability studies and DPOs. But anyway, and I wasn't an exec at that point, so I don't know. But I think that honestly, there is a point at which thinking, not just giving it's not just about deplatforming people who have already like had platforms for ages. And I think this is part of the reason why I think this letter was generally done by older people, because honestly, they don't need arts funding. What they need is just people shutting the hell up and letting them get on with it on their own platforms, and people not shaming them and people not telling them that they don't think that they're right. Which, again, I get why they're doing it from a self-interest perspective, but that's not all freedom of speech is. And in the end, a society with maximal freedom of speech wouldn't necessarily give these 150 people freedom of speech. A society with good freedom of speech wouldn't necessarily give J.K. Rowling freedom of speech. Individuals in a society with good freedom of speech would not necessarily, like, you know, talk about J.K. Rowling.
How does Stephen Yaxley then fit into all this?
Oh, you mean the guy who's leaving the UK right now for Spain?
Yes.
Yeah, that's Tommy Robinson, for the record, for any of you who don't know that name. Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think that it's, in some ways, I would say I would put him in the fascism category. He is basically, partly this is a discussion about, I think many of the people who he was appealing to were kind of groups of people who didn't feel listened to in many other categories. And again, that's an interesting discussion for freedom of speech, because actually, if someone doesn't feel listened to under many circumstances, then honestly, like, that's a discussion. Then honestly, why weren't these 150 people speaking up for them? But I mean, so they basically gravitated towards Tommy Robinson. And I think many of them kind of were attracted to his thing about anti-pedophiles, which again, I think there's a massive discussion. Again, if we're going to be freedom, if we're going to create our own small platform here, about the fact that child services and social services have been criminally underfunded for ages. And so honestly, if you're a children's home, you should see the statistics. It's horrendous how these people get treated, and honestly, the kind of decisions that they end up making, and blah blah blah. Again, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but there is systemic elements of this that of reasons that Tommy Robinson never really articulated. But there is a systemic element that never got discussed. Again, lack of platforms. You know, generally the media don't like talking about orphanages, and councils generally don't particularly care to talk about the topic either. And social services. Actually, one of the interesting things is social workers are generally put in their contracts for them not to talk to the media. Is that taking away their freedom of speech? Again, in care workers, it's a similar argument around. Actually, if you look at whistleblower defences, we actually have very few whistleblower defences in many different things. I would argue that's restricting people's freedom of speeches. But again, they're not J.K. Rowling, so I suppose, like, they don't count. So yeah, so basically on top of all of these different topics, you end up with someone who, in a fascistic way, had basically moneyballed the shit out of the situation, worked out how to sell himself to a crowd, and then ended up basically just said enough things that people people agreed with in some senses, and then we ended up where we are.
Sorry, go on.
So I would argue that. So in some ways, I would say that but I would say that. Yeah, go.
And I was just going to bring the racial element into all of this as well, because I'm going to use mine again, but I just want to make it clear, I don't know entirely what he said, so I'm not defending or saying what he said is wrong or right or anything. I'm just making the point that it seems to me that there's a race of like class element to it as well. If people seem to have rounded on him quite quickly. I mean, yeah, he should be dropped by his record label and all that kind of stuff. And people should have the right not buy his records or whatever, you know. But I'm saying the way some celebrities are just hounded on him, rather than try to see where, what he's actually saying, and if there's a problem with his thinking, to actually, have a debate with him and actually talk about it
I
and
mean,
see where the problem actually lies.
I mean, I would say a couple of things here. I have seen what he said, and oh my
Yeah.
God, it was incredibly explicitly anti-Semitic.
Yeah,
As in I have seen no, as in half, as in I have seen from, in the entire of, the Jeremy Corbyn blah blah blah,
yeah,
in that entire anti-Semitism saga, nothing was as explicitly
Yeah.
anti-Semitic as what the stuff Wiley was saying routinely.
Yeah.
So honestly, like, yeah. I would also say I agree with you in part, because I think that if you look at, like, I'm sorry, if you remember how often we saw, like, Nick Griffin, for example, or what was her name, Jodie Hopkins, Katie Hopkins, yes.
Yeah.
Oh my God, these people were routinely saying horrendous things. Or Tommy Robinson. Oh, you can go through
Nigel Farage.
Yes. And I mean, all of these people were saying stuff that is routinely as horrendous as anything that Wiley was saying. And so I'm not so. I don't disagree with the position, with everyone's positions on that. But can't we take the same positions on white people? Yeah. Like, apparently if you support Brexit, you could get away with saying loads of horrendous things, and basically people go, oh, we can't deplatform them because, again, I'm not entirely sure. Their freedom of speech is more important than Wiley's freedom of speech, apparently.
Yeah.
Most millennials' freedom of speech, honestly.
Yeah, I know it sounds like whataboutism, and I suppose
it is whataboutism in part, but it's important whataboutism in the sense that, like, I think that we should think about, if we want to be ideologically consistent, that's great. We should be ideologically consistent, but being ideologically consistent means, being ideologically consistent, and that means, like, treating individual cases the same. And if we're not, then, like, it's completely legitimate for other people to be like, yeah, you don't really believe that, because that's not how you act.
I always think that, in a way, you have to engage with people, because you have to like try and see where they're coming from, at least, because again, I don't want it to come out like I'm defending Wiley already, but he might have just been, he might have said something wrong, and then he might have just, because everybody's rounding on him, he might have just doubled down on it, get even more of a rise out of it.
Again, I'm not going to talk about Wiley too much, because, again, I don't particularly want to give him more of a platform. But I think that's a complicated case, because, honestly, again, with the fascism situation, again, I'm not saying Wiley's fascist, but I do think that racism and loads of these kinds of things rely on very similar principles that they kind of hotwire the system. And if you just go, and if you have a fairly blunt freedom of speech defense, and you go, oh, but and basically in this metaphor, if you just argue that anything that is a car should be able to drive, then anyone who basically manages to hotwire a car can drive, and you can make no arguments against them. Now, the problem with that is some of those cars are, aren't necessarily good. Some of those cars in this metaphor are fascist and racist and various things. And honestly, and I think that engaging with them does actually give them a platform too. So again, this is part of the kind of idea. And honestly, I will say, I think this is a complicated discussion, because in part, I think that one of the interesting discussions that anti-fascists quite routinely have is the problem with fascist speech is generally that it is it is bluntly put, there is very different assumptions and methodologies behind it. And so it's a little bit like, do you know about cuckoos?
No.
cuckoos are a bird, a UK bird. They nest actually around my house when I was in Wiltshire. But basically, they are birds. They're parasites. They have their native. They have other birds that they basically push their eggs out of the nest, and then they lay their own eggs. And basically, one of the things that cuckoos do is that they are evolved to basically they sound like have the same kind of sound as like 5 different birds, and this means that they get fed more by their parent birds. And so I would argue that there is that kind of parasitic behavior. And so, for example, if you look at half the stuff that, there was loads of fake news around Donald Trump, and Donald Trump was very good at basically parasitically kind of latching onto American media and onto Twitter and onto loads of other things. And so honestly, we have to be, and so there has to be a mechanism to stop that. Because in the end, I mean, let's be blunt with each other. Political systems require safety, require, the reason we have rights is to act as kind of a safety mechanism in politics. But in the end, so we need to have those safety mechanisms. There's no kind of, I would say there's no negotiation around that. But in the end, how we do that whilst maintaining freedom of speech and whilst thinking about how we're progressing. Because I would just say this. I think there's an interesting argument. Britain, traditionally, in the 1800s, had one of the best freedom of speech laws in the world. And so, for example, the reason why Das Kapital was written in the UK was because Karl Marx would have got executed anywhere else. Now, that's a thing. I think we should be proud of that, because in the end, Karl Marx should have been able to write his book, and that book ended up having massive impact on economics. That's the kind of, I would argue that when we think about freedom of speech, it isn't just about random people being able to say whatever they want. It should be about exceptional people having their work trumpeted. And in the end, I would say that then, it is worth pointing out that it wasn't just that Das Kapital led to entire revolutions in economics. So I'm not just in this saying that communism is right. What I am saying, though, is that honestly, that led to a lot of very interesting movements and a lot of very interesting ideas. And honestly, economics would be unimaginable without Das Kapital. So we should think not just about, real talk, Tommy Robinson's going to be forgotten in 10 years' time. He's long-term irrelevant.
Yeah, but Nigel Farage is not.
I would argue he is too.
Nigel Farage, yeah, but he's had massive impact on this country.
Again, in the long term, yes, I agree, but long term, he won't. And so in the end, we have to have our freedom of speech has to be discussed in the context of there's still going to be a Britain in 100 years' time. There's still going to be a Britain in 200 years' time. So in the end, we have to be thinking now about how our freedom of speech laws are going to positively affect those people, the next generations, not just kind of going, we have to, not just us allowing J.K. Rowling to spout off yet more stuff. And us going, well, she has freedom of speech. We have to allow her to say it. We can't argue against this.
But I want to say a couple of things here. Going back to cancelling people and ostracizing them or banishing them, to me that just puts the problem under the issue underground, and just out of sight, out of mind doesn't work. You have to engage it.
It does a little bit.
No, but you have to engage with it in the long term. I think because it just means in the age of the internet, you just go into the darker the documentaries of the internet, and that still exists.
I mean,
And
yes, although it's kind of worth pointing out that in most of these discussions, especially when we're dealing with high prestige things like universities and TV, then essentially those platforms have unique and specific value. Or Parliament would be another one. In the end, in the end, the fact that someone can't get a seat on the Houses of Parliament isn't, the fact that we choose that actually they're not good, their speech isn't good for TV. Again, neither of these things are freedom of speech. The fact that Katie Hopkins can't get interviewed whenever she wants on the BBC isn't like recognizably affecting her freedom of speech. So I think that to some degree we have to be careful, not just going, oh, but we can't just push them down, push them to blah blah blah, because it's like, well, there's still Twitter, there's still various other things. And I mean, if they want to go and get bitter, then they're probably going to get bitter anyway.
I'm not saying we can't push them down. I'm saying always pushing them down isn't always the only, and then you only get a certain view that is allowed, and then.
But in part, I think in part we're agreeing with each other without agreeing with each other, because I think it's like what I said with Tommy Robinson supporters. I think that there were some genuine problems that they wanted to highlight that hadn't been highlighted in decades. I think Trump supporters actually are in a similar position. I think there are lots of, there are many groups who have good positions or have interesting positions in some areas, but cannot get platforms for them. And in the end, the question becomes, in those contexts, how do you make the best of people?
Yeah.
Because in the end, the problem in part with fascism and Tommy Robinson and Nigel Farage isn't the fact that those people had opinions. It's the fact that they made the worst of those opinions. And and the worst of those opinions ended up having more effect on British politics than the best of their opinions. And that is, and that I think is kind of the deeper and more incisive discussion here. That I don't think that in the end, if Wiley gets pushed down, there will be loads of rappers. The question for that management company isn't like, oh, are they bad people for pushing Wiley down? It's how do they get the best rappers? And in the end, if they're not doing that, then they will get more and more Wileys, and and the entire thing had little value. So,
and how do we, as in terms of freedom of speech and getting a voice heard, as disabled people, how do we ensure disabled people's voice gets heard?
I mean, to some degree,
would you say?
This is a massive discussion. I mean, to some degree, I think the most interesting network I would like to produce is honestly on social media, because honestly, there's not that many like podcasts and things like that. And honestly, like, so that would be a start. Honestly, there are charities doing stuff around the BBC. There are various groups. It would be, the problem in many ways is about normalizing it, and about for example, having disabled people in crowd settings. That's one of the things that's kind of that almost never happens.
What do you mean crowd settings?
I mean, do you just when you have like a party scene?
Okay.
Like how many like disabled people are just kind of there in the background?
Yeah.
And honestly, very few people are going to be the star of the show. Very few people are going to be like in the top 5, but honestly, far more of them are going to be in that. And that I think works more to normalize things. I will also say that one of the things, do you remember we were talking about Breaking Bad? And you said you were disappointed in the son because he wasn't radical enough, he wasn't interesting enough, he wasn't.
Yeah.
And in some ways, like, I mean, you're not wrong. I don't think he is a particularly radical character. But I do think that, honestly, I don't think we can't have every disabled character as being radical. It's a question of us having enough disabled characters that some of them are going to be radical, and then those people who like that are going to like them, and those people who yeah.
Yeah, it depends what you mean by radical. What I meant to say was his character wasn't. He wasn't a very well drawn character. He wasn't a very like thought out character. He to me, I just found him. Maybe that was the point. I just found him fucking annoying. I'm not
I mean,
like, yeah, you should be representing me. I'm just like, you're just a fucking annoying person, and which maybe was the point. But it seems to
to
me that
me,
you're arguing for more window dressing.
I mean,
And as much as window dressing as we can possibly have, and slowly, incrementally, disabled people would start getting accepted. And I
to some
just
degree,
that's right.
to some degree, I think that I don't think that in terms of more disabled people's stories getting told, that sounds excellent. But at some level, I think I genuinely don't take it. I genuinely think that people who obsess over media in this context are kind of wasting their time. 90% of the harm that's done to disabled people is being done in the home. It's being done in standard situations. It's being done in the school. It's being done, And so honestly, going, oh, but we need to start like.
Did you get in the center?
But to start being like, oh, but we need to start, but we need to have more disabled stars. Like, to some degree, the problem with that is if you look at like African Americans, like they've had loads of like rappers. That doesn't actually change the fact that like that doesn't actually change their oppressions and things like that. So I think that in some yeah.
I'm not talking about representation. I'm talking about he was just a shit character.
I mean, I would say on Breaking Bad specifically, I think one of the interesting things for me, this is from a Hegelian perspective, a group dynamics perspective, is basically there was, I've been watching Breaking Bad very recently. I'm going to be watching the next, so yeah. I think that in many ways, what it's trying to, there's a deeper point, and the deeper point is just his job. Basically, there's kind of structural factors. So for example, they don't have an NHS, so he gets cancer. So his cancer ends up making him have to fork out hundreds of thousands. He has to make money. How does he make money? Drugs, blah, 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 blah. And then you get into the entire psychology and economics of drug dealing. But then in the family network, it was interesting in terms of there's an entire subplot where the dude's wife, the main character's wife, sorry, I can't remember names, the main character's wife, basically, she ends up in this situation where she can walk away.
Skyler.
Yeah.
Skyler.
She can walk away, but if she walks away, her only other option is this broke kind of upper middle class person who's kind of an idiot, and she ends up getting him killed, honestly. But that's it. But basically, so she ends up in situations where actually criminality is rife. And so in the end, she gets put in a whole bunch of sticky situations. I genuinely think that she's a more interesting character than most people give her credit for. I can't remember her name, I grant. But I genuinely think that in terms of discussions around feminism and the impact of in sociology, it was called women. One of the feminist theorists called women takers of shit, and it was very well done, and it was very well done how she was like how she basically had the option of either the Walter White or this kind of middle class, broke ass like guy who couldn't really deal with his taxes and all that kind of thing. And at least Walter White was smart enough to know how to do his shit until he ends up blah blah blah. And honestly, I think, and so next you get to the son, who in many ways is having to deal with kind of the reverberations from their relationship and the reverberations from kind of their unethical behavior and that kind of thing. And in many ways, what interested me in that is that he, in many ways, is trying to live a life of a good American and doesn't really understand what Walter White does understand, that actually that life is almost impossible. And one of the main ways of him actually making, he understands it's impossible and then starts dealing drugs. And and Tyler as well, she understands that it's impossible. And so he goes, okay, I'll just stay with this guy because honestly, there's not really other options. And he ends up, and so he, in many ways, is fascinating in the sense that he's living in delusions, despite the fact that there's actually a fair amount of evidence around him that he's not, or that the delusions are delusions. And so I don't know. I mean, that's kind of my perceptions. I don't know.
Yeah, but without this episode turning into a Breaking Bad episode, and giving a show that ended like 10 years ago more props than it needs, because it's had plenty of plaudits. And
so yes, you're absolutely right. I've kind of gone on a thing, but anyway,
yeah. So any last things on cancel culture or the letter?
No, I'm fine. What about you?
No, I just think we just need to make sure wherever we can to give disabled people more of a voice.
Oh yeah.
Make sure they actually not just give a voice, but actually get heard. Because there's one thing shouting, and there's another thing somebody actually fucking listening to you.
In some ways, I think one of the more interesting things, actually, I do have something to say, is kind of things like being writer and things like being producer and things like being, and kind of, in some ways, these are very significant positions. Not in terms of obviously you're not seen in the same way, but actually, if you want to have good disabled characters, you need writers who can write good disabled characters. If you want to, producers are the ones who are going to be choosing the actors.
Yeah.
So in the end, getting those kinds of skills down and getting those kinds of people employed, I think. But yeah, anyway, I will shut up and yeah.
Goodbye.
See ya.